And thanks for the invitation. So yeah, I think my understanding, I think I have presented to the environments sort of class before. So I think this is in the context of materiality and detailed design. So I think, as you said, I work for Oculus. So Oculus is probably a medium-sized practice, and these are the people, most of the people who are presently working with us. And I think obviously, we've been around for about 20, 25 years. We've got an office and studio in Sydney, Washington, and Melbourne. And I think, obviously lots of change over time, and these are the people that are presently working with us and presently making the work of Oculus. And I think, as was discussed, we do urban design, landscape architecture, and we also now do a little bit of architecture, so small sort of works and some bigger works at the moment as well. So, and I guess that's, part of having an integrated design practice, and I think the things that I'll talk about are not exclusive to landscape architecture, with the exception of perhaps working with soft material like planting. So we do work on infrastructure projects, small sort of pavilion structures, play spaces, public realm spaces, so across many scales. And I think, as was pointed out, our sort of particular interest is the social, but that's not at the not at the exclusion of the environmental. And I guess my sort of take on how I like to try and practice, not to say this is always successful, is that I'm very interested personally in how to connect people better to their environment and to each other. And I'm interested in sort of having a sort of focus that is quite on haptic and sort of empathy. And I guess one of the ways that RMIT looks at things is in terms of being about design, through design, or for design, and I try and position my practice within the practice of Oculus in those terms. And the only reason I mention it in the context of discussing materials and things that are related to spatiality is that I think that if you are designing things that are constructed, which I guess was an emphasis of this presentation, then you are doing it through design. So you're using design to manifest things. But I also think that there's a way of reflecting about the things that are built that is also for design. So I would like to think that every time we have something built, whether it's successful or not, that we are learning, and that what we do is feed that knowledge back into our practice, and that some of that is publicly shared, and that ultimately is for design. So it's actually in the interests of benefiting design and progressing design thinking. And then these examples were just because I do think it is important to not exclude thinking about plant materials when you're thinking about materiality. I think it's a point of difference for landscape architects that we are ultimately working with time, and that in particular is very different when you're talking about ephemeral things like plants. And again, these images are actually from images from Phytogreen, where we did a small installation that actually never opened to the public, but it was actually about using sort of Australian meadow planting and seasonal planting. And again, this is an example, I suppose, of using plant material and then gaining knowledge from plant material in terms of creating habitat. So these are just introductory slides, but I think, I guess positioning the idea of materials in relation to your course of structures, materials, techniques, and processes, and that I don't think you can really consider materials and materiality without considering structures, techniques, and processes. So materials have processes that obviously constitute them, and there are techniques that constitute them. They're embedded into structures, and they continue to evolve over time. So they will patina, they will change, they will fail. So I think it's important to consider that materiality can't be conceived of aside from these other parts of your topic. And I guess I was discussing with a book designer the other day what I guess ways that you might consider how we design space and experience. And I think he was asking for a word that might be different to words that you might use in other contexts. And I think it's interesting to think about the notion of phenomenology. So obviously a philosophical term, and we could spend probably the entire lecture touching on that. But I think if you just look at it in one sort of very high level kind of way, is the idea of conceiving of that our reality is constituted through objects and events. And I think in terms of landscape, we are designing using material form to create tangible and intangible experiences. And so I think that's something I'm particularly interested in. And I think it's just that some of those phenomena are more perceptible than others, and they're usually the material phenomena that are very perceptible. So I suppose, I'm sort of not going to show a large amount of technical drawings, which don't tend to lend themselves that well to this sort of presentation, nor are they necessarily that interesting. But I think it's important to understand, at least contractually, how these sorts of phases sit. So in the context of detailed design, And this is something that's been changing. So conventionally, we would have always done concept design, schematic design, which is an evolution of concept design, design development, which in turn further evolves as schematic design. And then what you would often do is something called tender documentation, which sets a contract price, and then construction documentation, which is actually how you've gone from agreeing the contract documentation and ideally not changing it very much and issuing that as a construction documentation, which will then be built, and then construction phase services, which are a way of ensuring that obviously what you have designed and documented gets built to meet your design intent, and then a defects liability, which can be anything from 23 weeks or 28 weeks to a year. Typically our work is a minimum of a year, so that's where you'll see if things fail or succeed, and the builder is contractually obliged to sort of rectify things, and that includes materials. And then post-occupancy evaluation, which I think on our better jobs and our more public jobs and our education jobs is increasingly a briefed part of that. So that's where you will formally go back over, maybe it could be 2 years' time, and see what's actually worked. And so I think what's happened though increasingly, because of the way that things are being built with increasing speed, is that you're increasingly bringing forward a level of detail design. So detail design now could sit anywhere from design development through to construction documentation. So detail design happens a lot earlier because things get priced earlier, which creates risk for us as designers, but it helps, developers, and it helps even councils and other authorities to actually get things sort of priced earlier and try and sort of de-risk the project for them. So I won't bore you with that, but I think it's quite a nebulous thing to think about detail design. And I also wanted to emphasize that some things you will detail more earlier because they're harder to detail, because they might cost more, because they require more consideration and more development, and other things you might detail later. So you might have a really clear fee with really clear phases and contractual obligations, but the way that we will work within a phase is to best interrogate our design to have the best chance of it being built and retaining it within a project. So it's not necessarily as linear as this. So this is a photo of our model shop. So we, as a practice, have always made physical models and still make physical models. I think that was our 3D printer before it got stolen, which has now been replaced. But anyway, so we do 3D printing. But we largely do physical timber models, and we do sort of some rough models. So we do models at different stages of the project for different reasons. These are very old models, but I guess I wanted to show these because they're about being photographed in a particular context and using the materiality of the context to convey some of the intent. So I think for us, using physical model making is the start of engaging with the material in a process. So there's obviously performance criteria to the model making materials that we use, and some things, if you can't physically model them, you can't necessarily build them. So it's not always to test the integrity of the design, but it is to create, I guess, convey a sense of materiality, or often just to convey a sense of tactility and spatiality. And so I think model making remains an important part of our practice that I think people across all levels of the practice still engage with. This is a model that was an entire precinct scale that actually was, I think, 1 centimetre over, and the developer picked it up straight away. So I think to your point, making your models perfectly to scale is very important and can be very costly if you don't. So the first project I was going to talk about is the Museum of Old and New Art, because I thought it was a project that people may or may not have visited, but may also have a sense of. So a project that is inextricably linked to the building and to the landscape. And this is a project that was in our office for 6 years and was quite early on in the practice of the Melbourne studio. So this gives you a sense of the context. So we did master plans for the whole site, but in particular did a lot of iterative project work that was never built for this project as well. So this is one of the first large-scale models that we made. So again, I think in this instance, using monochromatic materials is about actually reinforcing the space and the relationship between the elements, and not about saying that we will do everything in timber. So the choice of materials can be often about what you're intending to not communicate, as it is actually what you are communicating. So there's a neutrality to the monochromatic way that we model that puts the emphasis on the spaces in between and not actually the objects themselves. So just to show a scale, so this is we did lots of these small scale models. So again, I noticed that was at 1 to 10, so we'll do models 1 to 10 up to 1 to 1,000. So we've done entire models of docklands that we've had to design tables for. So we've worked across lots of different scales, and obviously when you scale up your model making, you have to consider or reconsider the materials that you use. But you can see these are all quite neutral and they're quite rough as well. They're not really intended to be sort of finished models. They're working models and they're detail models. I also wanted to emphasize the importance of the materiality of site. So I think, it's easy, especially when you have a very accelerated pace to projects, to forget elements of the site, but I think it's really important to understand the materiality of the site that you're working in, and that's often to do with whether you're trying to better contextualize a building, extend an existing landscape condition, or actually use the materials that are locally sourced. So if you are doing concrete, if you are specifying paving, those materials should and will be brought from close to that area. Therefore, the materials that you're working with should reflect the places that you are working in, unless you are trying to do something deliberately sort of dissonant, but that would be something that you probably would do a one-off aspect and not everything. So it's a pragmatic aspect, but it's also an important way of creating a sense of place. So these are just, again, early observational photographs, but just starting to show the materiality, the colour of the materiality in particular. Mona's cleft from a sandstone cliff, so it has a lot of change, a lot of movement, lots of water. It's very soft sandstone, so some of the way that we had to change our design through the detailed design process was because of a failure of materials. So the sandstone that we wanted to work with was too soft to work with in the application that we intended. And so that's what I mean by you can't just do it has to be an iterative process. You can't just say, I want this and I'm going to document it this way and I'm going to get it built that way. Sometimes that does happen, but sometimes you have to bring forward testing in order to understand the limitations of a material to see if that is actually your intent. And so some of these are things where we got things fabricated. Some of these are other elements that were site sourced. And then the weathering and patinaing, which is obviously a very present thing in the materiality of the building. But also I think, David Walsh is a very interesting character who's the owner and owner of Mona, and he sort of, I think, happily at one point said he wouldn't mind if the whole museum fell into the sea. So I think he is, and he has also subsequently undone a lot of our work. So I think there's a lot of change over time within the building, and that was the intent. So I think a lot of the materiality that's within the artwork itself is quite ephemeral and also changes over time. These are study models. So these are more about, I guess, using materials, I think material testing, but it was more to do with scale models. So these are models for the balustrades that actually were documented by FKA, but that we interrogated in order to see what the limitations structurally of the materials were to help frame views and try and dissolve the boundaries as you look out over the water near Berriedale. Again, using really simple and affordable materials like cork, monochromatic things, cardboard. So these are looking at the ways that we could start to define the setup for the planting on the green roof. And then we often use, not often, sometimes we'll use Photoshop or sort of Illustrator to actually overlay over physical models. So I think the beauty of having invested time in a physical model is that you can photograph it in many ways and you can manipulate it in many ways. You can cast light in different ways. So I think having a model is good because you take it to a meeting and people can get around it and they can actually sort of get into the space. But then I think it's also important to curate views of your model to actually convey what you want people to see in that model, which is not always what they will see if it's left on a table. So I think it's just, it's a great opportunity to curate and perhaps use post-production techniques to sort of alter those models. We actually used, I think the themes around Mona were sex and death. And so we used the Egyptian Book of the Dead barcode, which is an abstract idea, to actually work out how to initially sow sort of or put in the planting that actually set the original grid for the green roof. Now that wasn't important for people to know, but it was important for us to have an organising device that was quite regimented, that had a thematic reference back to the broader theme of the museum. And then obviously we were using the fact that plant material is doesn't always perform in the way that you anticipate. And will eventually do its own thing. So I think for us that was kind of a vaguely interesting idea at that point. And that's more, it looks more established than that now, but it is quite free range and a lot of the sedums have receded. And then this is sort of, some of these obviously are precedent images, but using an emphasis on materiality and how materiality can be used to actually help move people around. So I think this was some of our very early diagrams that were around sight lines and view lines and the idea of collection and dispersion even. So the idea of actually trying to sort of create points of intensity in what was essentially an open field condition, and then doing sort of almost like probably these are 30 centimetres by 30 centimetres, so very small scale models that can, be picked up and played with, but actually started to see how the material would perform. So in this instance, let's say it's timber and plaster. There are certain things about whether that you can actually cast plaster in between those elements is the same as whether you could cast concrete in between those elements. So we're not saying it's exactly the same, but there's certain performance things that would be quite similar in the way that we tested in that instance. And then these were, as you can see, also about similar size, but these are where you would ordinarily, as part of your detail design work, you would specify that you want to have samples produced, and those samples actually ended up proving that we were totally wrong and couldn't do what we wanted to do. But I think the idea was so this is some of the site source sandstone that ended up being too soft and broke, so the idea was originally to have that sort of integrated into the plaza, and then that was another sort of local source stone that also didn't really perform in the way that we anticipated. There would have also been lots of tripping issues, so I think it was just good to test at a very small scale and then at a one-to-one prototype scale, as you were just discussing. And then this was a model, so again, not a particularly attractive model, but a useful model in the sense that the element that's sort of a sandy red colour in the middle was actually an insert. So we had a base model that we could then insert different paving options into that became quite a useful iterative tool. And then looking at how we could create that idea of collection and dispersal. And so these are literally cut out and then inserted into the model and photographed and then pulled out again and then put other. So I mean, a pretty straightforward kind of task. But again, at the same time we were doing that, we were also looking at that in one-to-one and understanding how that would perform and whether it would achieve what we wanted to achieve. And obviously when you're looking at materiality, and certainly in a ground plane condition, you need to think about the idea of reflectivity and the environmental implications of using light reflective surfaces, which in some instances can be really good and in some instances can be really bad if they're adjacent to buildings, for example. And then I've inserted this because it seemed like a good idea at the time, but we used this image of a man throwing a brick and started to think about whether we could use recycled brick as a material, and we were quite interested in that for a while in different contexts. But I think to get a nice relationship to the weathered steel or the Corten. And so we brought David Walsh and Nanda Katsalidis into the office and had this brick there. And I think that essentially we thought that it seemed like a good idea at the time in terms of colour and change, and sort of ran through these slides and showing the different idea of having these pads that could sort of preempt some of the artwork locations or congregation points. So we sort of took him through all of that. And I think at the end of that, it really just kind of, and you can see how many of these we did to test. I mean, at the end of the day, it's going to be a $3 or $4 million landscape. So obviously doing iterative testing at this scale is much better than building it and then seeing it doesn't work. Strangely, it's good for business as well. So that's David Walsh on the left. And I include this sculpture, which is at Mona, which was a car crash. And I think that's what kind of happened. So I think he basically saw the red brick and decided that that material reminded him of clay court tennis. He really likes clay court tennis, he likes tennis, and that's why now the plaza has a tennis court on it and doesn't have any of our ideas on it. So I'm showing you that because there we have it. So yeah, I think you just have to be careful when you bring in get people into your office. But yes, I mean, there's something obviously that resonated with him about that materiality that he made a totally different connection with, which is actually ultimately, a lot of that is to do with our spatial intelligence. We draw on what we know from our childhood, what we enjoy, what we like, and his understanding of that was very different to ours. But at the end of the day, he does play tennis there, and I think it's quite a playful thing. And ultimately, this project is, whilst it's a very public project, is actually the biggest private gallery in Australia, and that's ultimately one of his homes as well. So, and then this slide was sort of referring back to the sort of life and death and sex idea within the gallery. So again, just talking about plant materials. So I think the plant material is reasonably subtle and not overly extensive, at least in the plaza. But the idea was using, I guess, plant material that resonated with, I guess, evergreen. So it was about having everlasting, or the idea of sort of cemeteries and memorials, which often use that type of planting. So I think it was understanding that plant material can have its own symbolism as well, and that was often to do with colour and to do with change. And so that was something that there are cherries throughout, I think, the plaza and the stair. which is to do with spring. And then we also were trying to talk to him about the idea of bondage in particular, which was obviously the sex reference, but also talking about different tree techniques and the idea of registering change over time and manipulating the landscape. And these are different propping techniques and sort of giant bonsai techniques, which he didn't really go for, which was a shame. But and then these ones are more sort of physical models. So we have, over the years made a lot of models of things that weren't built. But I think, as I was saying before I left the office on another project, often our work is not always about what's built. It's often about getting things not built. So it's often about stopping people doing things that will be very bad for the landscape, bad for the scheme. So some of these models were actually about sort of not putting ramps in and actually working out ways of moving people in a different and more effective way. So these were stair studies. So this is the stair that takes you from the ferry up to the plaza. And then these were sort of one-to-one prototypes of stairs. So I think, you could do probably a PhD on stair riser tread ratios. I think there's some very bad ones around Melbourne I could point you to, but and in lots of architects' offices. But so we did lots of prototypes of stairs, and I think, these are foam blocks, didn't cost a lot, but at the end of the day, it did create a really good ratio that can allow people to move up that stair quite easily, despite it being a very long, high stair, which I'll show you a photo of. And then that was in the end documented by FKA and integrated into the building package, and that's the stair before it was finished. But it is actually, we wanted to sort of have occupiable elements within that, but it is a compliant and easy to move up a stair. And then these are some of the sort of finished elements. And I was just going to talk at a sort of different scale and a different process. So Mona was a project that we worked on, as I said, for about 6 years. It had lots of things documented and lots of things change, whereas our involvement at the NGV has been a sort of much more informal and casual basis. So this is the Arts Centre precinct and the original plan for the NGV gallery. And I guess we're always trying to consider our work in the context of 19th, 20th, 21st century landscapes, but also in this instance in the context of cultural buildings and in particular art galleries. And so that's obviously about what they need to do. So these pictures show an open kind of lawn condition. So it was essentially a park, almost like an urban parkland setting, although the entire NGV garden is on a suspended rooftop. So it is a very successful green roof. And then some of the sculptures that were there. So I think it was really a very restrained and sort of pared back material palette, and which complements the pared back nature of the facade. And then, so I think when we got involved was really, so these actually I've just included because these were the structural drawings which show where you could actually locate trees which are within those green blocks. So lots of structural constraints. So all of the trees that you see there are on structures. Some are in containerized tanking and some of them in shallow profiles and build up. So these are the original Arapan, Sinatra, Murphy, the original landscape architects who worked on, I think, actually the renovation, which was in early 2000s. So these sort of interesting figures show lots of hedges. So I think a lot of our work, as I said, is either about stopping things being built, getting things built, or also sometimes it's about removing things as well as things change or uses change. So these are very sort of early sketches, but I think it was just really the first observation was understanding that the materiality of the forecourt that sits outside the Great Hall actually prevented people from going outside. So I think we came up for free with the idea of putting that synthetic turf down that's there now, and that is meant to be a temporary thing, but like many temporary things has not gone yet. But I think the idea was that sometimes like that space is perfect functionally, but it's so glary that it actually stopped people going out. So I think you need to understand the power of material properties and that they can actually prevent use, which in that instance was obviously a problem. And so these are just really early, very simple sort of studies about how you could actually remove things to make, I think, so it's just really about removing the hedges and trying to increase circulation. And I think, so what we've almost done is return it back to what it was before, but I think the way that we have modified it is in a way that actually has created zones. So we had to work with some of the beds that have been created as part of a temporary exhibition, and I think what we worked with Robin Barlow, who's a good friend of mine and an RMIT alumni and landscape architect, who so we were looking at perennial borders, which are quite topical. So I think, again, trying to understand how the landscape that we were sort of manipulating is sitting in the context of gallery that is ultimately a representation of cultural production now, and that's obviously art and design. And so I think ultimately what we were doing is actually creating more space for people, and that flexibility is becoming increasingly important in gallery contexts. And so these are just, again, this isn't really about materiality, but it is about space and using, I guess, very simple techniques to convey a client to do something. And I think we didn't really even do sort of proper construction drawings for a lot of the things that have happened there. So it's done much more like an event or an exhibition. So these are sort of done by somebody who's an intern with us. And then these are just the planting plans. So I think that's the thing where, I guess now, if, consider that planting is a material, one of the things that we are, like many firms, looking at is the use of Revit in our office. And so at the moment, if you are trying to put planting into Revit, then you lay it out like a carpet finish. So, there's lots of limitations to using Revit still for landscape, and we're still sort of playing with that a little bit. But I think that there is actually nothing better than probably doing a really good hand-drawn sketch to understand how the planting will work together, actually having it built, and then going back and seeing how it performs and modifying it. So instead of paying us lots of money to do, lots of documentation that probably they didn't need to build it, we could actually spend time in establishing a relationship with the garden and actually trying to ensure that the landscape succeeds. And so that's just, I guess, again, trying to understand that materiality is still spatial in terms of texture, structure, colour, and that I think landscape architects are still, probably increasingly engaging in a more successful way with planting. It's probably not always been a strength in our office, but it is something that we are increasingly collaborating more to emphasise that it is something that is integral to our design and as an ancillary part of our design. And then again, just starting to understanding how these things all sit in a bigger context from a material perspective. So I think it's really just a lot of, I think, again, in a different context before I came here, talking about how what we design is always not to see the design. So I think, again, what we have done is little tiny changes that have actually made quite they're sort of intangible in terms of what was, people probably can't remember there were hedges there before, but what it has allowed the landscape to do is to support events, to support programs. It's actually allowed the NGV to become exceptionally successful and seek significant state government funding. And so those sort of little tiny things can actually totally change the way that infrastructure and spaces are used, which is exceptionally valuable. Anyway, these ones are more, so these are very, again, trying to just show that they're very quick sort of before and after, so probably not as much to do with detailed design, but just trying to show that I think, again, materiality is as much about planting as it is about hard structure, and it is about texture. So very quick things that were done, not to say I think that cost $100,000 at Veggie Garden, so it probably wasn't that cheap, but I think just that was all about using very beautiful cypress that was virtually not free, very clean, and they would take on a black stain. So that was a really simple device of actually saying, well, we actually want to create a boundary, define the space, we want to more successfully extend the restaurant program into the garden. The restaurant's now been renamed the Garden. The produce that is grown there is used by the chefs as part of educating the chefs. It's also used with children's tours. It's also about the idea that now galleries increasingly have to reflect what people are doing at home. So I think there's an intimacy to what was done here, there's a domesticity to what was done here. So I think it ties into bigger sort of cultural shifts. And then it becomes part of their, so I think the NGV represent the interests of architecture and design, and landscape architecture sits within their sort of portfolio. And then again, using model making to communicate some of those things, which ultimately some of those things got built and some didn't. But I think there's a tactility to the model making which suggests that we are trying to establish an intimacy in that garden, and so that's obviously a scale model, but there's something about our attitude to the model that is also representative of our attitude towards the garden itself. Then I think I've just included these photos because I think that, I mean, obviously we get the opportunity to visit lots of the projects that we do if they're public. Not all our projects are public, but we do keep an eye on what people are doing on Instagram, just in terms of how people use our projects in a way that we intended or that we didn't intend. And I think it's part of, like I sort of alluded to, the post-occupancy evaluation sort of idea. So some of that can be done formally and some of that can be done informally. And I think that using observation ideally in person, but otherwise through perving on people's social media, is a good way of looking at how your designs work or don't work. And sometimes they work in a surprising way. I've temporarily forgotten this man's name, Bryce Mortlock. So this is the man who did the master plan for the Melbourne School of Design, which we worked on quite a few years ago for a few years with John Wardle Architects and Nadar Architects from Boston. So he was obsessed with brick as a material. So I think, obviously University of Melbourne is very contrasting in its campus design to RMIT, for example, which is obviously a city campus. So there is a really strong material palette there, which really, I think, gives a lot of cohesion to that campus. And that has sort of continued over the decades. So these are very early sketches of which we did thousands, but quite a few. So again, you can see there's a neutrality and a sort of material consistency even in these Photoshop renders. And then just showing, I think, again, if there's a simplicity to the material palette, can often draw your eye to other elements. So I think in the same way they were talking about that in the model making. So for us, it was always about creating a love letter to brick. So we continued the brick theme as was actually required, but also trying to understand how we could interpret that laterally. This was a model that we made for the architects actually to help better understand the relationship of the building to the landscape, our landscape elements, and then I guess what was essentially a sort of delaminating ground plane. So I think obviously physical model making is useful for testing topography. There's obviously sort of more machinic ways of doing that, but I think that we often will have buildings that you can pull out of our work as well. So I think it's important to understand, in particular the relationship of the ground plane. We're not always so interested in the facade. And then again, like I said, about using different photographic techniques and angles to convey different aspects of the design. It's a very slightly strange render, but I think we do use lots of digital rendering techniques, and I think a lot of what you can, again, construct digitally is not always going to tell you what you can do physically, especially if you play around too much in Rhino, but I think it's definitely helpful in terms of literally the elements of the constituent parts you'll need to conceive of something actually standing up. So we sort of had almost like a little internal competition, and a few people designed different brick sort of seating elements. I think in the end the first one I showed you was the only one that was built, but there's something that is a pretty literal translation of that digital model to get that built, but it did require input from a very good bricklayer. So simple. So I think it's just that thing of taking the material for a walk and using it in applications that it's not necessarily used in the rest of the campus. I think it was also based on our observation that a lot of students weren't actually sitting on seats, they were sitting on walls, and they were sitting on low walls. So I think a lot of our sort of approach to trying to integrate places for people to sit is often around the context that we create and not just inserting furniture elements. So we often look at proxemics and the sort of spatial relationships between people. So the idea of the sort of interpersonal communication, so whether it's sort of personal, intimate, social or public. So there are very particular distances that people sit between each other, and that can obviously be supported by the landscape. And then, where we got a little bit crazy with the bricks. So I think in the end, the white brick that we used, which much to our distress, failed. So that was we specified a particular brick, and at the 11th hour that brick was substituted because of a lack of availability. So I think in this instance, Melbourne School of Design was actually delivered ahead of time, and it was successfully delivered by a builder who got paid a large incentive to do that. But that puts a lot of pressure on the contractors, puts a lot of pressure on the people who documented it. So in terms of site supervision and approvals, it accelerates the process. So it comes with a lot of risk. So I think, we approved, in hindsight, probably wrongly, a substitution because we were put in a position where we had very little alternative, and in the end that white brick failed in that application. So I think, there are serious implications for products failing and our specifications failing, but in the end I think we resolved that to everybody's satisfaction. But I think, we have contractual obligations to ensure that our designs succeed and that they meet our design intent and the expectations of the client, and also to make sure that they're safe. So I think things like slipping and tripping and things that sound horribly dull are actually really, really important, and often that is to do with material selection as much as I think people are also very easy to dismiss material failure because of things like maintenance, but often it can be anything to do with the way that you originally sourced something, specified something, detailed something, and then went on to maintain it. So we are responsible for, I guess, all of those phases up to a point where contractually we're no longer responsible, but obviously you have to try and outline an intent for maintenance, in particular for the maintenance of materials. And then I just included this one because I still think it's one of our simplest models. So I think the idea was to literally have a planter bed that was an inclined plane that would face back to the dean's office, which is a private dean's terrace, only accessible to the dean and his or her guests. And so then that was digitally modelled, and then it was simple as actually trying to understand what materials could basically support a lightweight substrate structure and have that sort of elegance in it being quite a thin fold. So I think that's an instance where there are, obviously structural considerations. So all of our work would have been shop drawn and structurally engineered, and then just showing that as it was being built. I mean, I think in hindsight, at that point, I think we've learnt a lot more about green roof and podium landscapes and have done quite a lot of that sort of work. But I think in this instance, we really pushed the parameters of the depth of the substrate, which in the end determine the planting. And what you should obviously do in terms of best practice is decide your planting intent, choose your substrate to support the planting, and then the structure to support that. But in this instance, it was all about this very elegant fold. So I think, I think it's important to understand the material constraints. And then that was not long after its installation. But there is, I guess there's something in its sort of simplicity, which I think is quite appealing, versus the complexity and the textures and colours of the planting. And then I think probably this is the mass and road edge. So this was probably an element that was done the most in terms of being very iterative. So I think lots of constraints in terms of existing trees, and I think lots of issues to do with surveys and things. So I think this was really about almost folding the building down into the landscape, trying to support a little bit more occupation whilst being mindful that it's on the southern orientation. So we had to consider what lawn would work in that context. And then I just included this because we used a lot of physical models to test that edge. So really that was about saying, well, we've got to deal with significant level change, sort of work around existing trees, create, I suppose, what we ended up creating was opportunity for lots of skateboarders. But before that, we were intending to create opportunities for lots of people to sit and use laptops. So we did lots of studies around that edge. And I guess, these aren't super sort of polished images, but I think it does start to give you a sense of space in a way that lots of the renders that we did didn't. We often use sedums to try and more accurately, I guess, evoke the shadows that are cast by trees given their fractal geometry, and then just showing some of the iterative process about trying to work out how to resolve that edge. And then that sort of went through various digital processes, and working with the architects on obviously the folding of their building and the glazing and the mullions, and then trying to work within standards for fall heights and understanding the constraints of precast dimensions. So that was in the end a precast concrete edge. So I think we will often work between digital models and physical models, between Revit and Rhino, and increasingly Lumion. And then these are just what would be constitute more detailed design drawings. So I think that these are start to show, so that we would take things like, we would still at this point generally only issue CAD drawings and don't generally we do not at this point issue Revit models as part of BIM, which is Business Information Modelling, but we do, so we will give people our digital models, but at their risk. So you might do a digital model which tests the idea and then document it in CAD, which is what you're contractually obliged to do at this point, and then hand that over to a structural engineer who will put it through their models, and then they may send it to a fabricator. But again, it's at their risk as it's not a sort of a contractual kind of model. So that would have gone through lots of iterative processes, and we would have tweaked our drawings before a construction issue to ensure that they could be fabricated. So even if your drawings are 100%, there still could be issues, a construction issue, there could still be issues that are discovered through the shop drawing process, and the shop drawing process is also part of the engineering sort of certification process. So you can see how complex that very simple to model in Rhino edge and balsa wood edge, and then obviously the fabrication on site, which combines sort of in situ concrete pours with then precast elements. And I think, there were lots and lots of issues with this in terms of some of the levels not being what we understood them to be at the time, and so some major sort of changes that had to occur, and then just showing that through the construction process. But it's, from there you can hardly see that edge, but it does support a lot of occupation, and it does, I guess, protect the trees, and it also establishes new relationship between the buildings. And I think that's the last image. And then I just put this one in. So this is just a very small little exhibition we did at Tort Gallery, Tort Architects in Melbourne, and we were invited to do some sort of installation. So we decided to look at the concept of reason and experience. So essentially the idea of intuition and how we know what we know. And I think we basically tried to involve everybody in the office going out to the Melbourne School of Design and seeing essentially what worked and what didn't work. And that was anything from, you know, collecting leaves to interviewing people about the performance of plants to actually observing where people sat. And I think that's, I guess, what I'm saying about using sort of informal post-occupancy observation to actually inform your design. So there's lots of things that we know as a practice that we wouldn't do again, not just because of the exhibition, but just because we have a lot more experience, techniques change, and so I think it's a sort of, well, at least practice should be a constantly reflective thing. Like you can't, you know, it can take 3 years to get something built or longer. So there's lots of things that by the time they get built, you wouldn't necessarily even do them like that. So I think there's lots of things that you are constantly learning or should be constantly learning that should inform your design. And we do increasingly try and spend a lot of time observing how people use spaces before we modify them and how people use them afterwards, and are quite sort of honest in the office about that. And that's it. Just over. Is this where I say any questions or comments? I'm open to comments.
When you came to going through people's social media accounts and seeing like how they use the site, was there any sort of images that surprised you in a good way? I mean, like
Yeah. Yes, different parts of their social media accounts. I don't know. I mean, I think some of them are literally following things like University of Melbourne. So some of them are or NGV, so they're institutional ones, which obviously could be sort of slightly more manipulated for marketing purposes. I think Melbourne Uni's ones are all about individuals who attend or visit Melbourne Uni posting. I don't know, occasionally, not too much. I mean, I think it's more, you know, the angles that people are sitting at and strange. Yeah, it's usually the way people are sitting, but no, I mean, not a lot. I think it's also just, it's encouraging to see people using things, and it's even to sort of reinforce what you know intuitively about people will sit in the sun, people won't sit in the shade, people, you know, it's also that I think it's very revealing around how people self-aggregate, and how, especially we do quite a lot of education work, so don't sort of look at small children's social media accounts, but I think observing the way that children occupy space and the differences between the way that boys and girls occupy space is quite interesting. So we've done quite a lot of little observational proxemic studies for kids. So no, I don't think it's necessarily too surprising. It's more that it's encouraging, and it often, it kind of backs up what you know often to be intuitive. And I think with the NGV, it wasn't a big commission, it was a very small commission, and was just basically saying this doesn't work, that doesn't work, and if you do these small things, all of these other things can happen. And so I think it's often about that, let's say, you know, that was about removing hedges, it wasn't about designing furniture, but the removal of those hedges supported all these different forms of occupation. So I think that that's what I guess I'm interested in, is not about people being able to go, I can see that Oculus did that, or I can see that that's a design. I think it's often, good landscape architecture is often things that you can't really see, which doesn't necessarily, not always very good for the ego. But I think it's, you know, it's really good to actually know that things have been successful. And I think that that's not always the case, but I think it's good to understand, that people are using our spaces and places, and that it's changing people's perception of some of those spaces and places. And I think it's also, I guess what I quite appreciate is that people are photographing those things, which means it's important to them. And I think that that's, for me, really important, is to understand the role of landscape as part of the way that people live. And I guess going back to that idea of connecting people to each other and their environment is generally what a lot of our work seems to reinforce. Whether that works at a level of people actually starting to care more about their environment is a different issue. But I think it's about people increasing their value of landscape, which is good for us professionally and probably quite good for the planet, I suspect. So Yeah.
And big data, using that for
That's
design process, I think it's
Yeah.
a very interesting approach, especially if you look at the photo locations in Instagram, where these photos taken.
That's true.
and
Yeah.
maybe
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think, and that's kind of an interesting, I guess, sort of, there's obviously a lot that's bad to be said around big data and data collection, but there is a way of aggregating data in a way that we, just wouldn't have time to go out and look at all those things and be in Tasmania at that point. Or so I think there's, definite efficiencies in doing that, and then to see trends in behaviour as well. And demographic differences. And then I think in terms of human-centred design, I mean, I do think that's an important part of our practice. I don't think we've always rigorously done it in the way that is as much about observation as it could be, but that's something that we're increasingly doing. And I think a lot of people like, William H. White's work, so just really simple stuff, like it's not that hard. And we all do it all the time. So I think I quite like Jane Fulton-Suri's work from IDEO, which was quite pioneering at the time when she sort of linked, I guess, psychology and architecture. But, it's all stuff that we do all the time. But it's just that we need to get better at making those observations and then just tweaking things a little bit rather than sort of whacking loads of things in everywhere to be reductive. Any other questions or comments?
Just start with the detail and then design around the detail rather than have the design and then think about the detail afterwards. So like detail-driven design or like related or thematic. Like I feel like that the garden bed that you showed earlier was the idea of having that elegant fold, and you sort of came up with the idea of the undercut afterwards, or maybe that was the driver of that design. Because obviously when vegetation drove that design.
I guess. Whereas it should have been. And that's also differences within our way of practicing as well. Like different people in the office have different emphasis. So I think that, there's probably a singularity to the idea rather than the detail about the fold that was important. And I agree that, that's why I was quite honest about that that's not the way you probably should do that. But I think that it depends on, so the emphasis. So in that instance, that design was led by somebody who probably put more emphasis on structure than planting. Whereas, if somebody else in the office did it, they would do it the other way. So I think ultimately, ideally, look at it in both ways. So, I don't know. I mean, there are some details that, it seems like there are trends within the office in certain projects where people are trying to resolve or refine a detail to get it to work. And that could be a very personal thing within the practice. I probably don't have get quite sort of, I like to move on to the next thing, but I think there are themes within the practice that are trying to be resolved through different projects that are not necessarily about details, but there probably are about, sort of particular ideas. But I think some people probably work like that.
You said the project in India was actually helped success of them getting a grant.
I don't know if they would say that, but I think it's more that their extensive programming. So our landscape helped create more events in the garden, and their events program has helped them secure a couple of $1 million for specifically events. But yes, sorry.
Was that originally known to you guys that they would be applying these sort of things to those sort of programs?
No, not really. And I'm being sort of a little bit reductive, but I think, and it was over a couple of years, so I think it's more that there was an appetite, given there was a new director, Tony Elwood was the new director at that point, to actually unlock the potential of the garden. And I think that sort of started with his engagement and the idea of the annual architecture commission. So I think it's just that is a unique space within Melbourne. It's a very old roof garden, so it has certain qualities that really weren't being harnessed. So I think it was certainly part of our brief was to try and make it more events friendly and have more flexibility. But I think in terms of, the more cynical aspects of going after grants, probably not. But I think at the end of the day, there's sadly, those are the sort of metrics. They are literally measured on how many visitors they get, and those visitors support funding. And that's not necessarily, ideally you probably would support some underfunded independent arts organisations. But so I think it's more that, I think our brief, we all nearly always have a brief. We seldom, I think we are generally on brief. We sometimes return brief and tweak the brief, but I think, yeah, I mean, people, I guess, have different sort of motivations when they're briefing you, and those motivations can change as well. So, yeah, but it is good to know people's motivations if they're honest and honourable.
I think it was really nice and revealing when you talked about the model, sometimes the design testing model telling you what not to do. And I think for students that are struggling or perhaps just coming to grips with what design testing means, I think that's a really revealing thing that you actually make these things sometimes to just explore and to sort of work out what doesn't work.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably as much about what doesn't work than what does work, for sure. And I guess obviously based on experience, then you start to eliminate hopefully what doesn't work. But equally, if you're trying to do something you haven't done before, then, so I think it's kind of, we've done sort of one-to-one furniture prototyping, stairs and other structures, but ideally you get that done by fabricators, but that's always, you know, increasingly can be a struggle as well for architects and landscape architects. So I think yeah, I think it's also coming back to the planting thing. I think that, you know, when you, especially if you finish a project that is associated with a building, they think, well, I've got guarantees for my steel, for my glazing, for my concrete, whatever. So they expect guarantees for planting. And I think often, you know, with planting, you need to revisit, you need to change, and you can't test some of those things. So we've done we definitely did lots of trials for the green roofs on a few projects. So you can trial things in sort of comparable contexts, but yeah, certainly with planting, it's very, you know, some things just do not work in the way that you anticipated. But yeah, I mean, it's also part of the fun, I think. I mean, my favourite part of my work is getting things built. And sometimes, you know, you're having very frank and robust discussions with builders, but it's, you know, it's always a sort of trade-off of what, you know, you've done incorrectly versus what they've done incorrectly, and understanding where to really hold on to, yeah, the intent, I suppose.
Great, thank you very much.
No problem.